negotiated with Russia to avoid Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, which was actually the 8th year of an ongoing war, but a significant escalation. And before that escalation, President Putin had put on the table proposals for U.S.-Russia security arrangements that could have basically ended the conflict. The U.S. under Biden refused to negotiate those, another mistake. Then this war could have ended in the spring of 2022, just weeks after Russia's escalation, because what Russia wanted was for Ukraine to say, okay, we'll be neutral. We won't join NATO. And Ukraine actually said that immediately after the Russian invasion in February 2022. Zelensky said, okay, we'll accept neutrality. And in Istanbul, Russia and Ukraine, teams from the two countries, hammered out an agreement which was nearly completed in April 2022. And then the United States and UK jumped in and told the Ukrainians, no, you keep fighting.
Russia signaled it was ready to negotiate, and Ukraine even agreed to neutrality in early 2022. A nearly complete peace deal was drafted in Istanbul within weeks of the invasion, but the US and UK stepped in and told Kyiv to keep fighting. A war that could have ended quickly was turned into a long, brutal conflict, not by inevitability, but
are jumping up and down saying, no, Ukraine must have the right to join NATO, which would just continue this war and its devastation for no purpose. Zelensky is a dictator right now. He rules by martial law. The Ukrainian people are exhausted. They want a negotiated outcome. But Zelensky and a pretty corrupt government seem to want to carry on the war if someone will fund it and arm them. And so Zelensky's position is ambiguous. And what the Russians are going to accept will depend on the details of what's really on the table. Often what happens is that the United States pre-negotiates with Europeans and with Zelensky, and then turns to the Russians, and the Russians say, no, thank you. That's not an agreement. We'll continue to fight.
Europe keeps insisting Ukraine must have the right to join NATO, even though that guarantee would only prolong a war everyone is already exhausted by. Zelensky now rules under martial law, and the Ukrainian people want negotiations, not endless sacrifice, but Kyiv's leadership seems willing to continue as long as outside powers keep the money and weapons flowing. Meanwhile, the US pre-negotiates deals, presents them to Russia as final, and Moscow rejects them because they were never real compromises. And so the war drags on, trapped between Western agendas and a Ukrainian government with no clear path forward.
In general, on foreign policy analysis, it's important to understand that we use language in a very loose way. We say Ukraine says this, the Europeans say this, the United States says this, Russia says this. What we're talking about is elite decisions among a small number of decision makers that have various incentives, some corrupt, some for their glory or their own personal politics, not necessarily any real national interest. So my view is the Ukrainian people are exhausted and would like peace. The American people have no interest in fighting a war for NATO to enlarge to Ukraine. Are you kidding? This has nothing to do with American interests. And the Europeans, well, these are very unpopular leaders. Merz, the Chancellor of Germany, approval rating 25%, disapproval rating 60%. Some people don't have an opinion. Macron, he's even more despised in France. His approval rating tends to be between 10 and 15%, which is maybe not even statistically different from zero. And his disapproval rating is 70 or 80%.
Foreign policy is often framed as Ukraine says or Europe says, but in reality, these decisions come from a tiny circle of elites driven by ego, politics, and sometimes corruption, not national interest. Meanwhile, ordinary Ukrainians are exhausted and want peace. Americans have zero desire to fight a war, just to expand NATO, and Europe's leaders pushing this agenda are deeply unpopular, with approval ratings collapsing across the continent. This isn't the will of nations, it's the will of isolated leaders clinging to power.
In the United States, the problem is Trump is a very vacillating, actually weak figure. His whole public persona is to be the strong guy, the tough guy. But actually, he's not a very knowledgeable, not very intelligent, not very stable individual. And so he has some advisors who rightly want the war to end, and then he has some standard neocon advisors. He had General Kellogg, an octogenarian general, who basically not a total hardliner, but pretty much a hardliner. And then he has creeps like Lindsey Graham in the Senate, who's really, to my mind, the worst senator.
In the U.S., the challenge is that Trump presents himself as a strongman, yet his foreign policy instincts are inconsistent and easily influenced. He lacks the depth, stability, and strategic understanding needed for clear direction in a war like this. So he swings between advisors who want peace and neocon hardliners who push escalation. Figures like Kellogg keep him tethered to old militaristic thinking, while politicians like Lindsey Graham fan the flames even further. The result is a foreign policy driven not by strategy, but by confusion, ego, and the loudest voices in the room.
Right. It's usually said in our mainstream media that, oh, you can't trust Russia. But the fact of the matter is it's the West that has cheated and cheated and cheated again. The whole NATO enlargement was a cheat. When the U.S. overthrew Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, in February 2014. Obviously, that was a cheat, but it was followed in 2015 by the so-called Minsk Agreement, which was voted by the UN General Assembly, negotiated with Russia, Russian help, to say this war will stop by giving autonomy to the ethnic Russian regions of the Donbass, the two oblasts, Lugansk and Donetsk. Perfectly sensible. By the way, interestingly, I didn't know about it, but when I was in Italy recently and went to the autonomous German-speaking region of the north of Italy called South Tyrol, which is there because of land acquisition of Italy after World War I from the Habsburg Empire.
In the U.S., Trump projects strength, yet his foreign policy instincts remain inconsistent and easily swayed. He lacks the depth and stability needed to navigate a war of this scale, so he lurches between advisors urging diplomacy and neocon hardliners demanding escalation. Figures like Kellogg anchor him to outdated militarism, while voices like Lindsey Graham push conflict at every turn.
Losing on the battlefield, and there's nothing that Europe can do to turn that around. Then the idea was, well, Europe's going to buy vast amount of arms from the United States because Trump loves to sell armaments. It's his second job to selling golf courses, and he loves to sell arms. But even that, we don't even have stockpiles anymore, for God's sake, of the things that Ukraine needs, and needs in quotation marks, if this war was to continue. And Ukraine doesn't have soldiers. They don't have the troops. They're losing on the ground. So Europe is, and by Europe again, I mean Merz, Starmer, Macron, these three completely unpopular politicians, and van der Leyen, another one who is, absolutely beyond her depth in all of this, but also spouting out, will continue. They can't. What would happen if they tried that even temporarily is Russia would continue to take territory, and it won't stop with the Crimea and the four oblasts. It will go on to more and more of Ukraine. And
Ukraine is losing on the battlefield, and Europe has no realistic path to reverse that trajectory. The idea that Europe could simply buy more U.S. weapons is a fantasy. America's own stockpiles are depleted, and Ukraine no longer has the manpower to sustain the fight. Yet leaders like Scholz, Starmer, Macron and von der Leyen keep insisting they'll continue support, despite having no strategy and no public backing. If they push this war further, Russia will not stop at the 4 annexed regions. It will keep advancing because nothing on the ground is stopping it. Europe.
I think Russia has any deep desire to conquer and occupy all of Ukraine, much less to go on to the Baltic states or to invade Paris or Berlin or other crazy things that are being said right now. Russia does not want to be bullied by the United States. That's the core of what this is all about. The United States, by the way, back in the 1990s, didn't view Russia as a stalwart of a new multipolar order. It was the last thing on the minds of Brzezinski and his ilk. They thought the U.S. runs the world. It's a unipolar world. Russia's a second-rate power, but we'll make it a fourth-rate power. We'll divide it. We'll break it in pieces. Brzezinski openly speculated maybe Russia will become a weak confederation of a European Russia, of a Siberian Russia, of a Far East Russia. They fantasized about turning Russia really into a completely broken state. What has happened since the 1990s is the rise of China and the fact that despite Brzezinski's absolute explicit assurances in his writings in the 1990s, Russia and China found out that they're very complementary with each other.
Russia has no interest in conquering all of Ukraine or marching into Europe. The real issue is that Moscow refuses to be bullied by Washington anymore. For decades, U.S. strategists treated Russia as a broken state to be weakened, divided, and pushed out of global relevance. But the world changed. China rose, Russia stabilized, and together they formed a partnership far stronger than the unipolar fantasies of the 1990s. What was once imagined as a fragmented, helpless Russia is now a central pillar of a multipolar order. And that shift, not territorial ambition, is what truly unnerves Washington.